Pranams to all of you. This is part 3 of the video series on the life and times of Bhagavan Sri Ramana Maharshi. In part 1, we saw Bhagavan's birth in Tiruchuri, his stay in Madurai in his paternal uncle's house, where he undergoes a death experience which transforms his life completely. And in part 2, we saw Bhagavan's arrival in Tiruvannamalai, Arunachaleshwara temple, where he rushes to the sanctum sanctorum and embraces the Shivalinga. And thereafter, for a couple of years, he is in and around the temple in the 1,000-pillared hall and other places, including Padala Lingam temple. From there, he slowly moves to another place called Gurumurtam, Mango Grove, and so on. And from there, he slowly moves to the hill. He stays in so many other caves like Sadguru Cave, Guhai Namasivayar Cave, and so on and so forth. And then finally comes to stay in Virupaksha Cave, where Bhagavan stays for almost 17 years in Virupaksha Cave. Before we proceed, there's one other little story that we have to say. You know, sometime during 1913-1914, Bhagavan's mother, Aragammal, and Bhagavan's younger brother, Nagasundaram, they go to Tirupati temple to have darshan of the Lord, and on their way back home, the mother insists that they go to Tiruvannamalai and meet her son Venkatraman, and if possible stay with Venkatraman for a few days. So they reach Tiruvannamalai, and Aragammal is more than happy, overjoyed to see her son after so many years. But as she was with Sri Bhagavan, a few days later, after arrival in Venkatraman's place in Virupaksha Cave, she falls ill. And she goes through the suffering and pain of that illness for several weeks. And then when she's little all right, she decides that come what may, she will continue staying with her son Venkatraman. That's how the mother Aragammal, also joins Venkatraman sometime around 1914 and 15. So from Virupaksha Cave, Sri Bhagavan, his mother, Painiswami, and other people, they moved to another place called Skanda Ashram in the same hill. It's a very interesting story how this Skanda Ashramam came about. There was a devotee called Kanda Swami, a very close devotee of Sri Bhagavan, and he was looking for another place in and around Virupaksha Cave, more comfortable, little more spacious and so on. So he went and searched many places around that area, and finally, with the approval of Ramana Bhagavan, he locates a place and single-handedly, without anybody's help, he clears that ground, removes debris and big stones and all that, levels the place, and on his own, brick by brick, constructs what is now called Skanda Ashramam. He brings some coconut saplings, plants them in and around Skanda Ashramam, and makes it an ideal, lovely, beautiful place for Bhagavan and his attendants and his mother to stay. That's how end of 1915 and the beginning of 1916, Sri Bhagavan moves to Skanda Ashramam. And Sri Bhagavan wanted that ashram to be named after Kandaswamy, because he was the only one who built Skanda Ashram. So to honor him in memory of Kandaswamy, Bhagavan named that ashram after Kandaswamy, Skanda Ashramam. And from 1916 to 1922, almost for about 6-7 years, Sri Bhagavan was in Skanda Ashramam. That is where many more hundreds of devotees came, met Bhagavan, became his devotees and disciples, and so on and so forth. And in Skanda Ashramam, Bhagavan would guide his mother away from worldly things, deep into spiritual experiences. And slowly, Mother Aragammal began to, understand more of what Bhagavan was trying to convey and, say and all that. And she becomes more and more spiritual, deeply rooted in her own being. And very close devotees started coming to Bhagavan during Skanda Ashramam period. And towards the end of 1922, again Mother Aragammal falls sick, and it was quite serious. And all of them knew, Bhagavan and everybody knew that these were the last days of the mother. And during those last hours, Bhagavan stayed with mother for hours, 10-12 hours he would be with his mother, with one hand on the mother's head and the other hand on the mother's chest. For a long time he stayed like that. And the end came, and very peacefully in Bhagavan's hand, the mother passed away. And immediately as she left her body, Bhagavan got up and looking at everybody said, "Come, now let's eat." So after the mother left her body that night, her remains were brought down from Skanda Ashramam to a place called Palakkad in the foothills of the hill. And the next morning, by then the news had spread, and hundreds of devotees and people gathered around the mother's samadhi. And Bhagavan's younger brother, Nagasundaram, had taken up sannyas under the name of Swami Niranjanananda. Eventually becomes the manager of that ashram to look after the functional requirements of the ashram and so on. So he built a thatched hut over the mother's samadhi near Palakkad, and that year, on the 3rd of January, Bhagavan's Jayanti was celebrated near mother's samadhi. And somehow, because of so many reasons, Bhagavan had to stay in mother's samadhi. Again, the next day also, for some reason, he had to stay back. And that's how slowly, gradually, Bhagavan from Skanda Ashram moved to what is now called the present name Sri Ramana Ashram. That's how Sri Ramana Ashram started flourishing in the foothills of the Arunachaleshwara hill. And so when the whole group came down to Sri Ramana Ashram, they settled down there. In fact, Kavya Ganta Ganapati Muni had also come there and stayed with Bhagavan, giving talks and all that. So eventually they settled down in that place, which was eventually, as I told you earlier, called Sri Ramana Ashram. And it was sometime during the year 1923, after the mother's passing away and all that, when Bhagavan and his attendants, they started staying in Ramanashramam, that one of the greatest disciple and devotees of Sri Bhagavan started to come. Sri Muruganar Swami, a great Tamil scholar, poet, sadhaka, great devotee and disciple of Sri Bhagavan. So he started coming and he began to stay more and more and more with Bhagavan. Of course, he had a family and wife, but then he was so attracted to Sri Bhagavan that he started staying with Bhagavan. A great poet. And through Muruganar, thousands and thousands of Tamil, profound Tamil verses was offered to Sri Bhagavan. Most of it on Bhagavan and liberation and realization and so on and so forth. And then soon after, somewhere around 1929 or so, a cow from the town, along with its mother, comes to Sri Ramana Ashram. And the little calf would never leave Bhagavan. Eventually, it so happened that this little calf began to come more and more, almost every day, and stay with Bhagavan for hours together. And she would refuse to go back to the town along with its owner. Eventually, somebody suggested, let that cow stay with us. And that's how this little calf began to stay with Sri Bhagavan. And Bhagavan gave her a name, Lakshmi. That's how Lakshmi joined Sri Bhagavan. And almost for about 19-20 years, this cow Lakshmi served Bhagavan and his ashram. In fact, Bhagavan would later say she was one of the main reasons why the ashram developed so much. And sometime during 1946, the golden jubilee of Bhagavan's arrival in Arunachaleshwara temple was celebrated when Bhagavan was about 66 years or so. And sometime during 1948 in Ramanashramam, cow Lakshmi, her last few days remaining, and the last day of cow Lakshmi's life on this planet, she was lying down in the cow shed. Bhagavan went near her, sat near her, took her head and placed cow Lakshmi's head on his lap, put his hand on Lakshmi's head and the other one on her chest, spoke a few words and told, "Mother, you want me to be here?" And then slowly, tears were flowing down from cow Lakshmi's face, eyes, the face was so resplendent, the last few moments of emotions overwhelming Lakshmi. And slowly Bhagavan leaves the place, and within a few hours or so, cow Lakshmi breathes her last, and very peacefully she leaves her body. And Bhagavan would later remark that cow Lakshmi attained liberation. She was free. She became a free being. That's what Bhagavan used to say. Sometime during that period, after 1948 or so, people noticed there is a swelling, a boil on Bhagavan's left upper arm. And people thought that it is an ordinary boil, but then as the days grew, they noticed that the boil was becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. Eventually it was diagnosed as sarcoma, a very, very painful cancer which affects few people in the world. Sarcoma on the upper arm of Bhagavan's left arm. And once or twice they operated the tumor, and Bhagavan, the doctors from Chennai and many other places came with all their equipments and gadgets and all that, and in the ashram dispensary they did this operation, and Bhagavan refused all anesthesia, general or local. And the doctors were, they didn't know what to do. And they said to Bhagavan, "Bhagavan, we need to operate the tumor." And Bhagavan said, he looked at the tumor, the upper arm, for a few seconds and said, "Okay, now you do your operation, do your work." And as Bhagavan was talking and looking at the whole procedure, the doctors removed that big tumor from his arm. But then slowly, as we all know, cancer goes on coming back to many people. So in Bhagavan's case also, it came again, became more swelled and bigger, and towards the beginning of 1950, it was becoming pretty bad, and Bhagavan was growing weaker and weaker. His walk became very slow, leaning on his walking stick. So sometime during the month beginning and second week of April, he was growing weaker and weaker and weaker. And on the last day, April 14th, 1950, Bhagavan was in that small little room, which is now called Nirvana room, Maha Nirvana room of Sri Bhagavan. He was lying there with a big bandage on his left arm, so weak, and yet the face was glorious. The Tejas. And by then, thousands and thousands of people came to know that Bhagavan will be no more. And they all started coming. And they all had one last look at Sri Bhagavan. And as they were passing in front of the room, Bhagavan would look at each one of them, nod his head, look at them. That same calm, serene face. Though his body was suffering immensely. And that evening, April 14th, 1950, around 8:15 in the evening, suddenly the devotees who were assembled there in front of Bhagavan's room, they suddenly started chanting Aksharamanamale. All of them together. And suddenly, hearing that, Bhagavan's face lit up, brilliant glow. And exactly at 8:47, April 14th, 1950, Ramana Bhagavan leaves the body. And just before that, few devotees were crying, very close devotees to Bhagavan. They were crying and pleading with Bhagavan, "Oh Bhagavan, please don't go. Stay with us." And you know what Bhagavan said in that weak voice? He said, "Where can I go? I am here only. Where can I go?" Right? Where can infinity go? That which is immeasurable, infinity, the absolute, boundless, Sachidananda go. Bhagavan was always, right from day one, was telling everybody, I am not this body, I am not this mind, this is not what I am, what you think I am. But very few people understood. Even those people, those great devotees like Muruganar and many other devotees, they understood Bhagavan's teaching so deeply. That moment when Bhagavan left, they simply couldn't bear. Though they knew Bhagavan was not the body, and yet they started weeping, crying. And exactly at that moment, 8:47, 14th night, 1950, thousands and thousands of people had seen a very bright big star, a light, crossing the sky slowly towards Arunachala. People in many places of the country, including Bombay, New Delhi, Himalaya, so many places had seen this light moving. And many of them intuitively knew a great being is going away. And those who knew Bhagavan, they intuitively felt Bhagavan has left them. Exactly at that time when Bhagavan left his body, 8:47 on April 14th, 1950, 2 or 3 very, very interesting things happened. One, in Pondicherry, Sri Aurobindo Ashram. The mother of Sri Aurobindo Ashram was standing in the balcony that evening, and she just looked up And there was this light moving, brilliant light, slowly moving across the sky. The moment she looked up at that light, she knew Ramana has left. And she rushed to Sri Aurobindo's room, looked at Sri Aurobindo who was sitting there and said, Ramana Bhagavan has left. And Sri Aurobindo looked at mother and said, yes, I know. This is one incident. The other one, North India, Nainital. Another great sage, Neem Karoli Baba. He was sitting in his ashram, and again, exactly that same moment, 8:47, April 14th, that night, suddenly Neem Karoli Baba asked a devotee to bring him a glass of water. Quick, go and get me a glass of water. Very unusual. He never asks anything. But that evening, he asked for a glass of water. And immediately the devotee rushed, brought a glass of water, and he drank that water. After drinking that water, he closed his eyes and was very quiet for some time. And then people noticed tears flowing down Babaji's face. After a few moments, Neem Karoli Baba opened his eyes, looked at the devotees assembled there and said, India has lost a great sage. Of course, the people, in front of Babaji, they didn't understand what Babaji was saying. But later on, they understood Babaji was talking about Ramana Bhagavan. All these great ones know they exactly when Bhagavan left his body, they knew right at that moment. And why did Babaji ask for a glass of water? To decrease the pain of Ramana Bhagavan's body. The body which was going through a lot of pain because of that cancer. He was so thirsty, and Babaji knew. And for Ramana, for the body of Ramana, Neem Karoli Babaji drank the water. Of course, many of us may not understand the connection, but the great ones know what they're doing. And the third incident, Kanchi Maha Periva. He was camping in some place, and exactly at that moment, 8:47, April 14th, he was doing a puja in that place where he was camping, and he suddenly asked for this particular person, call him. And the moment this person came running towards Mahaperiva, he said, look up, look up. And the disciple, the devotee, looked up, and Mahaperiva was in an open space doing this puja, and when the devotee looked up, he saw this light moving. And immediately Kanchi Mahaperiva said, your Bhagavan, your Ramana Bhagavan is leaving. Thousands and thousands of people knew this intuitively. Most of them who saw this light moving in the sky, they knew, they somehow connected, this should be Ramana Bhagavan. Many of them who knew. right? So the great Ramana Bhagavan left his body on April 14th, 8:47 p.m. 1950. End of a marvelous life. This being, we don't know who this being really was. Of course, who this being was, we will talk about that in another video. So this great being came to planet Earth, took a body which was called Venkatraman, woke up, stayed in the body for almost 70 years and left the body, blessing and awakening thousands and thousands of people. One of the greatest sages of modern India, one of the greatest sage of the world. What a being he was, what a rishi he was, what a sage he was. Pranams to the great Sri Ramana Bhagavan. So with this, we come to the end of part 3 of the video series on Bhagavan Sri Ramana Maharshi. And in the next video, part 4, we are going to talk about the great devotees and disciples of Sri Bhagavan. Many of them. In fact, it is necessary to talk about them not because of their popularity and all that. Through them, the world understood more and more and more, came to know more and more about Sri Bhagavan. So, we are going to talk about those devotees and disciples in part 4 and possibly part 5, the last video in the series. We are going to talk about the reminiscences, stories from Bhagavan's life. Stories and anecdotes from Sri Bhagavan's life. Animals, people, events happening in and around the Ramana Ashramam and so on and so forth. Right? Thank you. Pranams.